not ready, so we're getting ready now. So I first started with the YouTube review, then I read the chapter, so I don't know if you get the wrong information from me, not my fault. Anyways, Reconstruction questions, the problem of peacemaking. So how should the South be readmitted? That was the main problem of the day. And should Confederate leaders be punished for being part of the Confederacy and something? But Lincoln died before he could figure it out. That's him dead. And so then he had to be taken over by Johnson. So radical Republicans. Lincoln, I think, was a Republican. Let me see. Lincoln was a Republican, and that was like the equivalent of Democrats today. And so radical Republicans, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, they wanted, I think this was Lincoln, wanted harsh punishment for wanted harsh punishment for the South and their leaders. Wade versus Davis Bill, 1864. Majority of white males must pledge allegiance, abolish slavery in the state constitution, and disenfranchise Confederate leaders, aka take away their ability to vote. And I'm pretty sure be part of any sort of like government or like mayor or stuff like that. You can't be part of the government anymore. And it was pocket vetoed by Lincoln, so it never became law. Okay, so I guess it was these guys making it up, and they wanted all this stuff to happen to the Confederacy, and Lincoln said, no, not cool. Presidential Reconstruction plans. Lincoln's 10% plan, which was basically 10% of the Confederacy, had to pledge allegiance and be like, I love the Union. It was developed prior to the end of the Civil War, so he's already thinking about it before they won. And it was much more favorable than radical Republicans, which I think was like a lot higher percentage or something. I don't know. This is the radical Republican. So his thing about 10% was a lot more popular. And 10% of voters in 1860 took an oath of loyalty, so I guess it worked. And Wade Davis wanted 50%. And so I guess 10% doing loyalty is a lot more preferable than 50%. And Lincoln hoped to extend suffrage to educated landowning African Americans, and that is him dead, because in 1865, president after Lincoln was Johnson, and Johnson favored oath of allegiance, where wealthy Confederates could get pardoned if they begged, because Johnson, his lore, he was poor as a kid and lived in the South, and he really resented rich Southerners, and so he wanted them to basically beg and be like, please let me back into the Union. And he wanted to appoint a governor to each state. I think there was like 5 or something, and they were all white. And it was basically to keep all of the South in check and make sure that they're still abiding by all the Union laws. And by the end of 1865, all seceded states met the requirements of Lincoln's or Johnson's plans. And so I guess it was one or the other. I guess no one was final. 20% of adult male population in the South died in the Civil War. So I don't know. I think it was a depression. Things were really tough. Lost cause. Southerners reminisce about how the South was prior to the Civil War, because now they don't have any money or people over there, and Southern leaders were revered. I think it was like Robert E. Lee. If he's not a Southern leader, that's going to be awkward, but basically they were like, wow, these Southern leaders are so cool, so great. Miss when we were not defeated in the war. Freedom for Southern whites. Freedom was from the North and federal government. For African Americans, it was having the same rights and protections as white Americans. Radical Reconstruction. Why did Congress start radical Reconstruction instead of just recognizing the Southern government? Like, why did they have to put all of these military bases and like Republican governments in the Southern states instead of just being like, okay, the Southern states are trustworthy, they can just be their own government now? And they did this because after I want to say this was before Reconstruction started, the South put in black codes, which is basically saying that like all black Americans had to be employed by a white American, and African Americans could be arrested for being unemployed. Southern states elected Confederate leaders in Senate. Oh yeah, so the South was putting all of the previous Confederate leaders, including the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, into their government, and so they were like, okay, everyone needs to calm down, no more Confederates, and so that's why radical Reconstruction started. 13th Amendment, abolish slavery. Most women will be happy with that one. 14th Amendment needed to ratify the readmit. Okay, so basically all the states needed to ratify the 14th Amendment if they wanted to be readmitted back into the Union, have the right to vote again. And basically the 14th Amendment sent citizenship to those born in the U.S., adult male suffrage, not for African Americans yet, just for white men, and then no Confederates in office. And separately, there's a civil rights bill, which was saying that, like, everyone born in America has rights or something, and it was vetoed against by Johnson. He said, no, I don't want everyone to have rights, because he, I think, was racist. And then Congress overrode him. I think this was the first time that Congress ever overrode anybody, and they were like, well, they're having rights now. So the civil rights bill happened, not because Johnson wanted it to. He did not want it to happen. And Tennessee was the first state to be readmitted back into the Union. And states, like, individually approved the Constitution and then were readmitted. Johnson was impeached because radical Republicans disliked him, I guess because he was just the opposite of Lincoln. And he did something that I don't remember, but he fell short of one vote to be removed. And African Americans made up the voting majority of many southern states. So 20 black males in the House of Representatives, 2 in Senate, 50% white children were in school, and 40% of black children were in school. Most African Americans were in the Republican Party, so the Republican Party was really strong and at its peak. And then there was this whole thing that, like, all the freed slaves would get 40 acres and a mule, and land ownership was freedom. So Johnson gave the land back to the white South, of course, because he was racist. So the goal was for former slaves to get land so that they could be landowners and be free, but Johnson said all the land is going back to the South. To the former owners. And so then sharecropping started, which I think by the end of, closer to the end of the 1800s, it was more white sharecroppers than black, but it was that you just worked and you were given all the materials and you worked for your rent and board. And then there was a crop lien system, which is just a ton of credit, like 50 to 60%, and people were just really, really bad debt. And now 1869 to 1877, Grant is president. I think he was for 2 terms and he ran for a 3rd, did not get it. Grantism, which was in the Ken Burns video, is brought up here, and that's talking about him. Credit, mobiliar scandal, whiskey ring, panic of 1873, Specie Resumption Act. So basically, Grant's entire administration is known for, like, a lot of scandals, but they were all his cabinet, at least according to John Green, and not actually him. So I guess he wasn't that bad, but who knows. So basically, all of his cabinet accepted bribes off this scandal, and then more false tax report and bribes, and then overinvesting in railroads, and debtors favored printing paper money, eliminating greenbacks, making things hard for borrowers. It was hard financially during this time. And so then the KKK was created, basically because there was a ton of black American voters for the Republican Party, and the South did not like that, and they said, like, we need to go back to white supremacy. So then they went, like, evil mode, started a terrorist group called the KKK, where basically they were intimidating people out of voting. It was extremely violent. There was a massacre at Colfax, Louisiana. There's an average of 187 lynchings annually, and this led to the Enforcement Acts of 1870 to 1871, which allowed the government to prosecute federal criminals and use the military to protect individual rights. So things got so bad that the government intervened. And the Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction, which meant no more troops, no more government from the Union in all the southern states, which many considered Reconstruction a failure. Education levels began decreasing after Reconstruction, and basically it was the end of the Union being in all the southern states, saying you have to make everything equal, no more racism, no more slavery, and now they left, so then things went back to being pretty bad. It was the New South, so post whatever it's called, Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction. So there's education advocation for black Americans. Booker T. Washington, he was a former slave. The Atlanta Compromise, meaning that African Americans wouldn't challenge segregation if they had economic opportunities, meaning like jobs, which I think was a really controversial point because most African Americans wanted complete equality, just racial equality to white Americans, and so they weren't really on board with this. Plessy versus Ferguson was the whole separate but equal ruling, saying that basically segregation was okay as long as the two were equal. And Cummings versus the Board of Education, 1899, court ruled that it didn't have to be equal. It just had to be one of each, and that was especially prominent in the school because a lot of schools were not equal. So poll taxes, literary tests, and there was so to be able to vote, you had to pay a tax, and then you also had to pass a literary test. And a lot of like African Americans faced a lot harder literary tests, but it got so difficult that it was hard for like white voters to vote, and it was like backlashing against them. So this was created in order to prevent African Americans from voting, but they made the test so severe to try to stop them from voting that it was hurting white voters too. And by the late 1890s, the black vote decreased by 62%, and the white vote had decreased by 26%. So it was stopping everyone. And so then they created the grandfather clause, which basically said, if your grandpa could vote in 1860, so before the Civil War, then you can. So if you're white. Like, those were the only people who were voting back before 1860. And then eventually this gets voided by, like, the court because it's bananas. That doesn't make any sense. And there's Jim Crow laws, which, because most Southerners never accepted racial equality, they were just being forced into it, and so they went back to being really racist. This is legal segregation in the South, Moore, Plessy versus Ferguson, so the severed but equal. And the 14th Amendment did not protect from private discrimination. So it stopped the government from discriminating against people based on their race, but it didn't stop private facilities such as like trains or voting or, I don't know, just job employment from being discriminatory. And so in 1892, Ida B. Wells spoke out against lynching. She was a black journalist, and a lot of her friends got lynched. And so she aimed for a federal anti-lynching law to prosecute those responsible for lynchings and